The petition shall designate a committee of 10. There's some discussion in the law about a committee of 10 that's sort of the interim decision-making system while you're negotiating contracts. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but let's talk just about teacher contracts, for instance. If you have 2 or 3 districts that are consolidating, you have 2 or 3 formal contracts with teacher unions. Who's negotiating those if the board is about to be eliminated, if all 3 boards are about to be eliminated? How do you go about doing that? And so there's some, and this is drawn out more in the law, but there becomes this committee of 10 where a majority of 7 can make a decision. And that allows you to start planning all the contracting that would go into the new district. So what does it include? All the fancy colors are simply a way of showing there's a lot of things that have to be talked about. And probably the most important thing on the slide is this right here. When I talked about a lengthy process, I talked to several of my colleagues who've actually been through this downstate. And if you start to think about all the things, even in your own home, that you deal with, and if you were to merge homes with somebody else, how would you merge the 2 mortgages? Who's going to pay, or what does the new gas bill look like, the new electric bill? And that's kind of the notion. So in school districts, we would be talking about who has debt. So how's that debt going to be consolidated or reconciled? What happens to any of the assets? Sometimes there are discussions about eliminating a building or combining 2 buildings, or there's those kinds of discussions that come up. What happens with the assets? Well, that can even be down to the lawnmowers and the tractors and any assets within the districts that are being consolidated would have to be addressed. How will contracts be consolidated? Now, I referenced that a little bit further down, but what my colleagues tell me is that this is one of the trickiest things. One district may have a Xerox contract that's for the next 5 years. The other district might have something with impact for the next 3 years. Someone may have a contract for vendors and Coke machines. They may have a different vendor or different vendors for food service. Some districts will work with Sodexo or places like that. So there are all these different contracts. The largest ones clearly will be your personnel contracts. And you always see this in the news about how districts are working with their teachers union and their support staff union, trying to negotiate those contracts. Well, districts have put a lot of work into that, and now you're trying to combine that into one. Now, I've often been asked, so what happens then with different pay scales? That's a very tricky, that's not a simple answer. But in any environment, teachers or any environment, if one union has negotiated a pay scale at, say, this level, and the other one's negotiated a pay level at this level, it isn't likely that's going to average. It's just not how employment works. It's most likely that maybe progressively one comes up toward the other. All that's got to be figured out. But typically what happens is it isn't that you regress to the mean in terms of salaries. It might be that one group is kind of frozen or has very small increases while the other is catching up. It may be that as a total union, they negotiate one salary scale that's somewhere amenable to both sides. But typically what that means is that one comes up closer to the other. All these other contracts, like personnel, or utilities or transportation or any of those are negotiated then as though, probably with that committee of 10, they're negotiated for the brand new district. So all of this takes a great deal of time. Somebody, as you're trying to facilitate, there may be cases where people say, could we eliminate a building or could we reorganize our buildings? You know, that maybe there's a different way to use them if we were one whole district. All that takes a great deal of time. So the contracts tend to be the trickiest piece. once you get to that point, you start to build a budget. And you try to decide what would a budget look like for the new district. Educators will tell you, once you have a pretty good idea of the contracts, our personnel costs in schools are typically between 80 and 85% of the entire budget. So you can pretty much set that coming out of your employment contracts, the personnel contracts. But once you've figured out the other, all the other contracts and kind of what those expenses are, you start to build a budget. Then you figure out what kind of revenue has been historic in the district. Many of you probably know, when we're trying to build our budgets in school districts, it's based on the amount that we're able to levy, which is based on a tax rate. So if you don't know the tax rate yet, it's hard to know how much you'll levy. You have a pretty good idea of EAV because you can take the different districts and hook that together and tell what the value of the community is. But until you know the tax rate, you don't really know how much your budget's going to be. In this case, you have to kind of work from both ends, and you'll see that in a minute. You start to build a budget. You look at what the revenue might look like. What is the plan for transportation? I have been cautioned over and over that transportation ends up almost being sort of the last thought. But if you're reorganizing the buildings, you may have some students that are now traveling across town. How are you going to handle that? Is that a new contract? Is that an expanded contract or reduced? Maybe there's a way that you can reduce that. But with a different configuration, there's undoubtedly some conversations about transportation. How will the facilities be accounted for? To be really honest, a lot of people from this region have talked about the referenda over the last few years. There's been lots of discussion about maintenance of buildings and need for improvements or upkeep. So in all of West 40, I mentioned this year $500 million of improvements. So how are we going to account for the facilities? What happens with teachers' contracts? I've talked about that. What happens with teacher evaluation? And how will RIF lists be consolidated? I can spend more time if you're interested in that, but in Illinois there's a system, pretty elaborate system, where every district has a joint committee. That joint committee has put together an evaluation system that explains how teachers are evaluated, and then based on those evaluations, how they're going to be put into a RIF list in case there were ever times to reduce the number of teachers. Well, that's done at a district level. Back to this notion that we like local control in Illinois. And so every district has a different version of that. And that would be something that would have to be negotiated and figured out how we're going to do teacher evaluation in the brand new district. I've already mentioned contracted services and contracted employees. So if you think about all the operations that happen in your school, there are many, many, many of these that aren't necessarily first clear or apparent until you start peeling back that onion in terms of contracted services. And that's everything from mowing the grass and plowing the snow and how all that works. So the disclaimer here is it's overly simplified for discussion purposes. Part of the petition says that you have to tell what the maximum rate would be for the new district to levy. So one way to think about this is if you figured out what the total budget was going to be, and you were able to divide that by the value of the land and industry and the community, you end up with a tax rate. Now, some people, it's kind of like what I was talking about contracts before. Some people say, well, wouldn't it just be the average tax rate between the two districts? And it isn't a numerical average, but it's somewhere in between, most likely. It's impossible to speculate what kind of savings there would be. You know, most people today talk about consolidation as a way to save money. Is there a way that we can have some economy of size? In general, it's somewhere in between the 2 or 3 or 4, right? That as you get all of that, the value of the property, and you look at your new budget of the new district, somehow you have to come up with a maximum tax rate that could be levied. And it's just most likely that if you live in a district that currently has the lowest tax rate, that tax rate is probably going to go up some. And if you're living in the district that has the highest tax rate, you probably benefit from the economy of wealth, and the tax rate will go down a little bit. But until you figured out, this is relatively easy in an additive way, until you figured out what the expenditures are going to be, what that new budget's going to look like in a brand new district, it's hard to map backwards to what the maximum tax rate would be. So you can imagine in any negotiation there are some winners and some losers, and it would be somewhere in between. So after all that work, there is a petition that's put together. Frequently these are hundreds of pages, and including all of those pieces. Now that petition is then submitted to me, well, whenever the project's done, whoever the regional superintendent is. I think it's still going to be me. And then I would immediately publish a notice of a hearing, and I have to do it 3 times in 3 successive weeks in a local newspaper. At that hearing, any resident can speak relative to the petition. They can appear in person or through an attorney and provide oral and or written testimony. Further on in the law, it talks about whichever entities are petitioning are responsible for the costs of the recording and the transcription. So if the districts were doing that collaboratively, they'd split the cost of having that done. The petitioners also pay for the posting in the newspaper. So we would hold that hearing. We would have a court reporter, and we'd have an audio recording to record the hearing. And the only thing that happens at this hearing is an open meeting where people can take turns sharing their opinion about the petition. So whether they're in favor of it or against it, you have a chance then to appear in person and provide testimony. Once that's done, it's my job then to make a decision on the merits of the petition. So as you can imagine, there are 2 real components. One is, was everything included that needed to be included? When I think about this, I think right back to my teaching days. Right? Did they include all the pieces? And the second part is how relevant was the content? So this quickly, oops, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that. Here we go. So conditions, the needs and conditions of the affected districts, and the area adjacent there too. So how does this impact the local area? Division of the funds and assets, we've talked about that. So I'm looking at how well the petitioner or petitioners have planned to deal with the funds and assets. Best interest of the schools, and if I get to know some of you better, you'll know this is always me. Best interest and welfare of the pupils. What is in the best interest of the students? And so it's my job to look at those. Now I have 14 days from the hearing to make my decision, either approving or denying the petition. So within 2 weeks, I'm going to make a decision and write up that decision. I find this interesting in the process, but the next step is, regardless of my decision, my decision immediately then goes to the state superintendent. So I could say I'm not approving it, but it still goes directly to the state superintendent. Yes?
Just if you do deny it, do you give a written response on why you deny it, or the state superintendent, if he denies it or she denies it?
So I'm going to say there are 2 answers to that.
Okay.
The law does not require,
Okay.
but it would be something that I would do.
Okay.